The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the windows of the Parker family's house as the storm raged outside. Rain pounded against the glass in relentless torrents, each drop a soldier in an unyielding assault. Thunder cracked through the sky like a whip, shaking the walls, while flashes of lightning momentarily turned the night an eerie shade of blue. It was the kind of storm that made the world feel smaller, swallowed by the sheer force of nature. Inside, 5-year-old Ethan Parker pressed his tiny hands against the cold window pane, his breath fogging up the glass. His blue eyes, wide with a mixture of wonder and unease, watched as the towering oak tree in their backyard swayed violently in the wind. Shadows danced erratically across the yard, shifting with every flicker of lightning. "Ethan, dinner's ready," his mother Julia called from the kitchen, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the storm. The warm scent of roasted chicken filled the house, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. His father, David, folded his newspaper and cast a glance toward his son. "Quite a storm, huh, buddy? You're not scared, are you?" Ethan shook his head slowly, though he didn't turn away from the window. His little fingers pressed harder against the glass. "The trees are talking, Daddy. They're telling stories." David chuckled, amused by his son's imagination. Ethan had always been different. More perceptive, more attuned to things that others overlooked. The boy saw magic in the mundane, heard whispers in the wind. Lightning illuminated the sky once more, followed almost instantly by a deafening rumble of thunder. The lights flickered, dimmed, then steadied. Julia sighed. "I hope we don't lose power." But Ethan wasn't listening. His small body had gone completely still. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. His little head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond the storm. And then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Mommy, someone's crying." Julia exchanged a glance with David, then forced a reassuring smile. "It's just the wind, sweetheart. Come eat." Ethan shook his head more insistently now. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not the wind. Listen." David sighed but humored his son, leaning in to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the storm. But then, there it was, a sound that did not belong, a high-pitched whimper, thin and desperate, carried by the wind, a cry for help. David Parker tightened his grip on the flashlight as he stepped into the raging storm. The wind lashed against his face like icy fingers, and the rain stung his skin with every drop. Lightning split the sky, revealing the towering oak tree at the edge of their yard, its massive branches twisting wildly. But it wasn't the tree that sent a chill down his spine. It was the sound. A pained, desperate whimper, barely audible over the storm's fury, yet unmistakable. "Daddy, hurry!" Ethan's small voice was nearly drowned out by the howling wind as he struggled to keep up, his little rain boots splashing through the puddles. David's gut twisted with unease. The closer they got to the tree, the clearer the sound became, a whine filled with agony and fear. And then, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw her, a German shepherd. Her fur, matted with mud and streaked with blood, was chained tightly to the tree. The thick metal links had dug so deeply into her neck that raw, open wounds oozed beneath the rusted collar. The chain had wrapped around the bark as if someone had meant to leave her there to die. "Oh my God," David whispered, stepping closer. The dog's amber eyes lifted to meet his, wide and filled with a silent plea for mercy. She trembled violently, whether from the cold or sheer exhaustion, he wasn't sure. But there was something else, her belly. It was swollen, heavy with life, her labored breathing hinting that she was dangerously close to giving birth. "Who would do this?" David muttered, anger rising in his chest. Ethan had already dropped to his knees beside the dog, unfazed by the mud soaking into his pants. He reached out a tiny hand but hesitated, afraid of causing more pain. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're here now." The dog whined softly, her ears twitching at the gentle voice. Then, despite her pain, she licked Ethan's hand, a gesture so full of trust, so heartbreakingly grateful, that David felt his throat tighten. "We have to help her," Ethan choked out, his small fingers trembling against the chain. "She's going to have her babies." David cursed under his breath. The padlock securing the chain was rusted shut. They needed bolt cutters. "I'm going to get the tools," he told Ethan, shrugging off his rain jacket and wrapping it around the shivering dog. "Stay with her. Keep her calm." Ethan nodded, placing his little hands on the dog's side. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. And through the storm, the dog let out a long, trembling breath, as if she finally believed it. David burst through the front door, his boots tracking mud and rainwater across the wooden floor. Julia looked up from where she was setting towels by the fireplace, her face tightening with concern. "Did you find?" "German Shepherd," David cut in, already moving toward the garage. "Chained to the oak, pregnant, bad shape. I need the bolt cutters." Julia's breath caught. "Pregnant? Ethan's with her. She's scared, but she trusts him." Julia didn't hesitate. She grabbed a thick blanket and followed her husband back outside. The storm was still raging, but now it felt different, more menacing, as if the night itself was holding its breath. When they reached the oak, Ethan was kneeling beside the dog, whispering softly. The flashlight cast a trembling glow over them. "She's hurting," Ethan said without looking up. His voice was small but steady. "She's trying to hold on, but it's too much." David set to work, the bolt cutters biting into the rusted chain. The metal groaned, then snapped. The dog flinched but didn't move. The collar, however, was another problem. It had cut deep into her skin, a cruel reminder of how long she had suffered. "We need to get her inside," Julia said, draping the blanket over the dog's shivering body. "She's going into labor." David hesitated only a second before scooping the dog into his arms. She was lighter than expected, her ribs pressing against his forearms, but her belly was heavy with life. As he carried her toward the house, Ethan walked beside them, one small hand resting on the dog's side. Inside, the fireplace cast a golden glow, a stark contrast to the storm raging beyond the windows. Julia and Ethan quickly made a soft nest of blankets and towels. The dog collapsed onto them, her breathing shallow. Then she let out a long, painful whimper. "It's happening," Julia murmured, kneeling beside her. Ethan grabbed his father's sleeve. "She's scared, Daddy." David rested a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "She's not alone." The first contraction rippled through her body, drawing a sharp cry. Julia took a deep breath. She had never delivered puppies before, but she had helped birth a calf once. This couldn't be much different. Then, just as the first puppy began to emerge, a shadow flickered outside the window. And for the first time that night, David felt truly afraid. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the living room walls. The storm outside had begun to ease, but the tension inside the Parker home was thick, pressing down like an unseen force. Julia sat beside the exhausted German Shepherd, gently stroking her fur as 5 tiny newborn puppies nestled against their mother, blindly seeking warmth. The room should have felt peaceful, filled with the quiet miracle of new life. But David couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He stood near the window, staring out into the darkness beyond the backyard. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, the wind now whispering instead of howling. Yet something about the night still felt wrong. Ethan, curled up beside Luna, had fallen asleep with one hand resting on the dog's side, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. But David's instincts screamed that the danger hadn't passed. Then he saw it. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the porch light, a shadow moved. It wasn't the sway of branches or the trick of the dim lighting. It was a man, tall, motionless, watching. David's pulse kicked up. "Julia," he murmured, careful not to wake Ethan. His wife turned, immediately noticing the rigid set of his shoulders. "Someone's out there." Julia sucked in a breath and turned toward the window. The shadow didn't move, but David knew, whoever he wasn't just a passerby. Then, as if sensing their eyes on him, the figure stepped back into the trees, swallowed by the night. David's stomach tightened. That wasn't an accident. He was watching us. Julia swallowed hard. Could it have been a neighbor? David shook his head. No, he was standing there too long, too still, like he was waiting for something. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. David moved swiftly, checking through the peephole before unlocking the door. Dr. Rebecca Holloway stood on their porch, soaked from the rain, a grim expression on her face. "I scanned the dog's microchip," she said, stepping inside. "You're not going to like what I found." David's breath came slow and steady, bracing for the worst. "This isn't just some abandoned stray," Dr. Holloway continued. She glanced at the sleeping Ethan, then at Luna, who weakly lifted her head. Her name was Athena, and she was a police dog before she was stolen. David's jaw tightened. Julia's hands clenched at her sides. Stolen? She echoed. Dr. Holloway nodded. 2 years ago. And her registered owner? She exhaled sharply. Victor Blackwood. The name hung heavy in the air, as if it carried a weight all its own. David didn't need to ask why it sounded familiar, because he already knew. Blackwood was the man in the trees. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic crackling of the dying fire. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a dense fog that clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud. Julia stirred in bed, the uneasy feeling that had lingered all evening refusing to let her rest. Beside her, David slept lightly, his arm draped protectively over her waist. Then came the sound. A sharp, muffled thud, so soft it might have been mistaken for a tree branch shifting in the wind. But Julia knew better. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened, her heart hammering against her ribs. Another noise, this time a metallic click near the back door. She shot up, shaking David's shoulder. "David, wake up!" His eyes flickered open, instincts kicking in immediately at the urgency in her voice. He didn't ask questions, just listened. And then, a sound that sent ice through his veins, the low, anxious whimper of a dog. David bolted upright. "Luna?" They raced downstairs, Julia's fingers fumbling to switch on the hallway light. But nothing happened. The power was out. David cursed under his breath, grabbing the baseball bat from beside the door. Julia's trembling hand found the flashlight on the kitchen counter, and as she flicked it on, the beam illuminated the wide-open back door, swaying slightly in the misty air. The living room was empty. The nest of blankets by the fireplace where Luna and her puppies had slept was disturbed, the scent of damp fur lingering in the air. Ethan's small voice suddenly cut through the darkness. "She's gone." They turned to see their son standing at the foot of the stairs, his face pale, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. Julia rushed to him. "Ethan, sweetheart, stay here." But Ethan shook his head, eyes wide with fear and something else, certainty. It was the bad man. He took Luna. David's stomach twisted. He knew it before Ethan even said it. Blackwood. He sprinted toward the yard, scanning the damp earth for tracks, and then he saw it. A chain, rusted and cruel, discarded near the oak tree. Dark stains smeared across the metal, a warning, a message. Julia's voice came behind him, shaking. "David, we have to find her." David exhaled sharply, already reaching for the car keys. "We don't have time to wait for the police. We're going after them now." Ethan's voice, small but unwavering, followed them into the night. "I can feel her. She's scared, but she's still fighting." The headlights of the sheriff's cruiser sliced through the thick fog as they approached the sprawling, isolated estate. Blackwood's property loomed ahead, a dark fortress nestled deep in the woods, its stone facade bathed in eerie moonlight. The wrought iron gates were already open, as if he had been expecting them. David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Beside him, Julia sat rigid, her breath shallow, her hands clenched into fists. In the back seat, Ethan sat eerily still, his gaze locked on the looming house. "She's in there," the boy murmured. "She's trying to find her puppies." David exchanged a look with Julia, but there was no time for questions. Sheriff Wilson was already stepping out of his vehicle, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. He approached the front door with measured steps, his voice firm. "Victor Blackwood, open up. We have questions about the stolen animals." Silence. Then the door swung open, revealing Blackwood standing in the dimly lit entryway, his expression unreadable. He was dressed too neatly for the hour, a silk robe draped over his frame, his pale blue eyes as cold as the night air. "Sheriff," he drawled, as if this were a social call. "You do realize it's quite late?" "I realize a lot of things," Wilson replied, stepping forward. "Like the fact that a dog and her litter were stolen from a veterinary clinic tonight. I have reason to believe they're on your property." Blackwood exhaled through his nose, feigning boredom. "Do you have a warrant?" The sheriff's jaw clenched. "Not yet, but I do have probable cause." Blackwood smirked. "Then by all means, have a look." He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. David didn't hesitate. He followed Wilson inside, his gut churning. The house was pristine, every detail too perfect, like a stage set, hiding something foul just beyond sight. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, a sound cut through the stillness, A sharp, desperate yelp. David's breath caught. Ethan bolted forward, heading toward a side door before anyone could stop him. "Ethan, wait!" Julia cried, chasing after him. The boy reached the door and threw it open, revealing a stone staircase leading into darkness. The stench hit them immediately. Wet fur, urine, blood. David pushed past, his flashlight illuminating the hidden horror beneath Blackwood's estate. Cages, dozens of them. Dogs packed into rusted enclosures, eyes wide with terror. A fighting ring, stained dark. And in the farthest corner, Luna, chained, bleeding, protecting her puppies with everything she had left. Luna stood her ground, her body trembling from exhaustion and pain, but her amber eyes burned with fierce determination. She positioned herself between the rusted cage holding her puppies and the towering figure of Victor Blackwood, her lips curled back in a low, warning growl. Blood matted the fur around her neck where the embedded chain had once been, but she didn't waver. David moved swiftly, grabbing Ethan and pulling him behind him just as Blackwood lunged. The sheriff shouted a warning, his weapon raised, but the chaos erupted too fast. One of Blackwood's men grabbed for Luna, and she attacked without hesitation, her teeth sinking deep into his forearm. The man screamed, staggering back, but Blackwood was already reaching for something inside his coat. David's heart slammed against his ribs as he saw the flash of metal. "A gun! Get down!" Wilson bellowed. But the shot never came, because at the exact moment Blackwood raised his weapon, Luna launched herself at him. The impact sent them both crashing to the cold stone floor. Blackwood roared in fury, struggling under the weight of the wounded but relentless dog. He struck her. Once, twice, the sickening crack of his gun's handle hitting her skull echoed through the cavernous space. "Luna!" Ethan's scream cut through the madness. Blackwood managed to throw her off, scrambling to his feet, but Luna was already pushing herself up, swaying but refusing to stay down. Her body was failing, but her spirit, her love for Ethan, her duty to protect, was unbreakable. She moved again, one final surge of strength, just as Blackwood turned his gun toward the boy. A single gunshot rang out. For a terrible second, time froze. Then Blackwood crumpled, the sheriff's bullet embedding deep into his shoulder, sending his weapon skittering across the floor. The fight was over, but Luna, she staggered, her legs buckling. Her breath came in uneven, shallow pants. Ethan broke free from David's grip, rushing to her side before anyone could stop him. "No," Ethan sobbed, cradling her head in his small hands. "Please, Luna, stay with me." The dog's eyes softened. She weakly lifted her head, just enough to lick Ethan's cheek, a final tender goodbye. Then, with one last breath, Luna was gone. Ethan's wail of grief echoed through the dark. And in that moment, as the world around them blurred into silence, the bravest heart they had ever known stopped beating. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, hushed voices, and the distant wail of sirens cutting through the cold night air. Sheriff Wilson barked orders as deputies swarmed the underground lair, unlocking cages, freeing the terrified dogs that had been condemned to a life of suffering. Animal control officers moved swiftly, their faces grim as they assessed the wounded. But for Ethan, none of it mattered. He knelt beside Luna's still body, his tiny hands trembling as he stroked her blood-matted fur. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his young mind refusing to accept what had just happened. His protector, his friend, was gone. "Luna," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Wake up." She didn't. David placed a firm but gentle hand on his son's shoulder, his own grief evident in the tightness of his jaw, the moisture pooling in his eyes. "She saved us, Ethan," he murmured. "She saved you." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his small frame shaking with silent sobs. The puppies, nestled in a crate nearby, whimpered softly, sensing the loss of their mother. One, the smallest, let out a pitiful cry, inching toward Ethan as if drawn by his pain. Dr. Holloway knelt beside them, her voice gentle but steady. "We need to take her," she said softly. "We'll bury her properly. She deserves that." Ethan didn't move. Julia crouched beside him, brushing his damp hair back. "Sweetheart, she's not really gone," she whispered. "She's in them, in the puppies, in you." Ethan sniffled, glancing at the tiny, helpless creatures. His gaze lingered on the runt, the one he had saved when it was born, the one that had struggled but fought harder than the rest. Slowly, with a reverence that seemed beyond his years, he reached out and gathered the puppy into his arms. It nestled against his chest, its warm little body pressing into him as if seeking comfort. "I'll take care of them," Ethan said, his voice quiet but filled with something unwavering. "Like she would have." David's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Then we will too." As they stepped outside into the crisp dawn air, the first hints of sunlight cutting through the darkness, a breeze stirred the trees. Ethan turned, his breath catching. For just a moment there, beneath the towering oak, he saw her, Luna, strong, proud, watching. Then she was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind and the legacy of her love behind. Luna's story is more than just a tale of survival. It is a testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, a reminder that love, loyalty, and sacrifice are not limited to our own species. She was more than a dog. She was a protector, a mother, a warrior who gave everything to shield those she loved. Her journey, from a stolen, abused creature to a hero who fought for her family, reveals the heartbreaking reality that too many animals endure. Luna was lucky to be found, but how many others suffer in silence, unseen and unheard? Her sacrifice uncovered a hidden world of cruelty, where animals are treated as disposable, where suffering is ignored. But through her strength, through her final act of love, she changed lives. She saved Ethan. She exposed evil. She gave her puppies a future. Ethan's promise to care for Luna's legacy is a promise for all of us. We must be their voice. We must protect them. Not because they belong to us, but because they are worthy of dignity, respect, and love. If this story has touched you, let it be a call to action. Speak up for animals in need. Support rescue shelters. Stop cruelty where you see it. Luna fought for her family. Let us fight for hers. Because sometimes, the purest forms of love, the bravest hearts, come not from words, but from the silent loyalty of a dog willing to give everything. For us.